Welcome to Montgomery County Republican Club's Direct Line Live program. Today, our special guest is Gefen Kabik, and our hosts are Jackie Saxton and Mark Uncover. Take it away, Jackie.
All right. Thank you, Dwight. So as Dwight said, this is Direct Line. I'm Jackie. I'm joined by Mark and Gefen, and we are here to talk about the wonderful state of Israel, one of our greatest allies in the United States, and the state of that relationship, the amazing 73rd Independence Day that Israel just celebrated, and all of the, things going on in the area surrounding anti-Semitism. Plenty of topics to discuss today. I know Mark is probably going to lead us off with questions because he always does way more research than I do.
So tell us about the elections that are going on. What are we up to with the back and forth elections in Israel?
Yeah, I'd be glad to take that away. If you've been following at all the news, or honestly just even glance at it, you might feel like it's Groundhog Day. You keep seeing articles about Israeli news results, and that is because they have had, I believe it's been 4 elections in a period of 2 years. Israel is a parliamentary democracy, which means they don't have a set intervals for elections like we do in the US. And they've been unable to reach a coalition of 61 seats. Israel's parliament, the Knesset, is composed of 120 members. So you need 61 seats to form a majority in it. And the political parties have not been able to work that out. The Prime Minister's Likud party, which is a center-right party, has been consistently the number one in these, but that means getting about not even 25% of the vote. That is how fractured the Israeli electorate is. One of the interesting things of the most recent elections is that a substantial majority of the actual seats won were won by parties to the right of center. However, there is so much fighting between these parties. You have parties ranging from very secular parties on the right to very ultra-Orthodox religious parties on the right. Is that all these intrapersonal issues, often people being discontent with Prime Minister Netanyahu, they haven't been able to form a coalition.
And some of that criticism of Netanyahu, you hear a lot about that over here as well, that there are a lot of people who have some criticism for him as the leader of Israel. And we'll get into more of that line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism later. But, do you see that a lot with people you talk to about Israeli politics over here, and that people are like, they want to stand with Israel, but they don't support Bibi as a leader in the way that they used to?
Absolutely. One of the things many people might be surprised is that I would be 100% willing to bet that there are more critics of Bibi Netanyahu within Israel than outside of Israel. Just as in the United States, many Americans were opposed to President Donald Trump. Many Americans were opposed to President Barack Obama, but we were all Americans. And I would say at least most of us still supported the country and are proud of the country. And it's just like that in Israel. Netanyahu, he's been the prime minister for now over 10 years, I believe. It's been an incredibly long time. His party has been totally dominant in Israeli politics for the past at least 10 years. The center left has totally imploded and died in Israel. It is basically non-existent. For the first 30 years of Israel's life, basically, it was a labor government, a left of center government, until Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the Likud party. And they were the giants of the Labor Party. They were the giants of Israeli politics, and now they are nothing. They're irrelevant in Israeli politics. So the center left has been totally defeated in Israel, and so all that political infighting is among the right. But you have many people even if they're aligned very politically or on policy issues with Netanyahu, dislike him either personal reasons or believe that he's not fit to be prime minister. There have been accusations of he's been accused of, and he's currently in a trial for bribery and related issues.
Maybe not bribery, but it really is a wonder how, that Bibi and Trump were friends. They seem so similar in that way, right? That there are plenty of people who loved him when it came to issues, Trump, but just could not get over, his persona.
Yeah, absolutely. I think many Israelis, even ones who are not fans of Netanyahu, will tell you that Bibi has been excellent on foreign policy, on security. Security has always been Israeli voters' number one issue. That is the most important issue, more than all other issues combined. And this has been the most peaceful decade in Israel's life. It may seem violent and chaotic when you turn on the news sometimes, but compared to previous years, it has been incredibly quiet, relatively speaking. And Israel has opened up diplomatic relations with Arab countries, something that would have been thought impossible just years ago. And it's shown that Netanyahu has been very skilled in the diplomatic, in the foreign policy, in the defense realm. So many Israelis like those things, but they also think it's time for a new leader. Or they might believe he's corrupt, while still being able to recognize that. So that is a very good point, I think, Jackie. It's many people said that they liked President Trump's policies, but they might not have liked him as much. Mm-hmm. That's something you have oftentimes with many politicians. But thank you. I've never thought of it that way.
Yeah, and you're spot on with safety. And I've been to Israel twice in the past decade, and neither time did I ever feel unsafe. And I don't think the alarms went off any time that I was there. So that was good.
Yeah, that's one thing I just always, when I'm talking to people about Israel, is one of the misconceptions that I'd like to, clarify is that Israel is an incredibly safe place to be. Never, not once have I felt the slightest bit scared of anything in Israel. I felt like I was in more danger at times walking around in DC than I have anywhere in Israel.
100%.
And incredibly safe.
Conversation, because Mark, you're planning a trip to Israel, right?
I am. Well, part of it is because so many other countries haven't really been, or have, how shall I say, a diminished prospect of being open because of COVID, that Israel may well be one of the better alternatives this year.
Israel's doing the vaccine distribution correctly. When they have leftovers, they walk out in the street and like, hey, you come get jabbed in the arm.
Israel's vaccine rollout has been an incredible success. Part of that, I think, is due to it being a relatively small country with a relatively small population. It's already a very high-tech society. And they are living, for the most part, their lives as if it were pre-pandemic. I was watching videos earlier today of some of the events and ceremonies for Israel's Independence Day, and people were partying in the streets. I would have thought those scenes were from 2019. So it's good to see a glimpse of the future, I guess, hopefully for us. But Israel has just executed it absolutely fantastically, and they've also seen close to 90% reduction in cases and severe hospitalizations and deaths from COVID, which is just absolutely incredible.
And I want to touch on what you were talking about a little bit with how technologically advanced Israel is. We were talking a little bit about this before the show, in that, and I said this exactly. I said I would love for people who are so anti-Israel and so anti-Zionist to live a week without anything that has come from Israel, and they don't realize what they would lose: their cell phones, a lot of their medications, cancer treatments, things like that. So can you talk a little bit about that and how much Israel has really contributed to the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's some of Israel's first innovations were really not very high tech at all, and were products of necessity. For example, things like drip irrigation. Israel is not exactly in the most fertile area of the world. They do not get a lot of rain, so they need to maximize their use of water. So they invented drip irrigation, so they could grow more food with less water and wasting less water. And that was out of necessity. One of the funnier things, at least I thought was funny when I was a child, was that they were pioneering in having toilets that have the high flush and the low flush, so you wouldn't waste water. But even now, they've been just so innovative in the technology realm. Really, since I would say, the mid '80s up until now, they've just been an absolute powerhouse. You have companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, Intel. They all have major offices in Israel because you have a highly educated workforce and it is so innovative. Everyone now uses Waze for GPS. That is an Israeli invention, and it makes everyone's life so much easier every day. The USB drive, that was invented in Israel. It has, I believe, the most startups per capita of any country in the world. And it's just incredibly innovative. Every year, well, except this past year, because of COVID, I go to the APAC annual policy conference, and they often will have a showcase, an innovation showcase of Israeli innovations. And they're oftentimes incredible, a machine that can literally make water out of air. Really magic, or a device that lets someone who is paralyzed walk again. Just incredible innovation that is helping people throughout the world.
Yeah, we have a very close family friend who became very ill in the U.S. right at the beginning of the pandemic or right before, and she is Israeli. And her family made the decision to move back to Israel because the best place for her to be to treat the rare condition that she had was in Israel and an Israeli hospital. And it really is.
The Israeli, as you'd expect, a country full of Jews has many, many doctors. It's the hospital system there is absolutely fantastic, and it's just really it is. You also have major pharmaceutical companies in Israel as well. Teva Pharmaceuticals, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, is an Israeli company.
Talk about a little bit about the last year has seen a huge change in the Middle East of countries establishing relations with Israel. And obviously there's a hustle, I say, a real politic element to that of the countries who sense that their real enemy or their real threat is Iran, and see an opportunity to work with Israel and basically not have a two-front war, not that they needed to in the past, but how does that change? How do those changes impact Israel, and how does that change the dynamic in the Middle East?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to this past year, Israel only had diplomatic relations with formal diplomatic relations with two Arab countries, Jordan and Egypt, both as the result of U.S. Facilitated peace treaties. And these were not exactly warm relations, but there were relations, there are economic ties, but they're not exactly the closest of relations. I would say over the past decade, we've been seeing more and more reports of informal ties between Israel and many Arab countries, the Gulf states, and also Saudi Arabia, notably. Always unofficially, always under the radar, but also always related to security issues relating to Iran. Iran is the major, I would say, opponent of the Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. The Gulf states are Sunni, and Iran is Shia. So they are different types of Muslims. Think Catholic versus Protestant, but with a far more violent history. And they see, the Gulf states see a nuclear Iran as an existential threat to them, because Iran has been exporting terror throughout, not just to target Jews in Israel and Jews throughout the world and Americans throughout the world, but also Sunni Muslim countries. And they see Iran as their number one threat. So quietly over the past number of years, stemming originally from working together on security issues, ties had grown gradually closer. And so first and last year it was announced that the United Arab Emirates would be doing a deal with Israel to normalize relations. Bahrain soon jumped in, and we had recently Sudan join in on it. And it's looking like Oman will also be joining at some point soon. And these have really totally changed the dynamic in the Middle East. It has been, after Israel's founding, all the Arab countries got together and basically issued a declaration called the Three No's. It was no recognition, no diplomacy, no peace, I believe. I may be misremembering what exactly the Three No's were, but it was absolute refusal of any recognition of the state of Israel.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's just it is really historic that they are recognizing it, but it is also, these have been a very warm peace. The UAE is eager to have Israelis come and visit. Israel is eager to have Emiratis come and visit. It's going to lead to huge economic opportunities for both countries. It's, the number one thing I see, on Facebook and Twitter of, friends and family living in Israel is them being really excited about a new vacation destination.
Yeah.
Because Israelis were prohibited from going to these countries before, totally prohibited. And so, obviously, though, it's much more than just a new vacation destination. It will mean that these countries can work more together on security issues. They can work together publicly on diplomatic issues. And it also means that these countries can better help the United States by working together.
I think my favorite headlines I saw was like Saudi Arabian hotels to start serving kosher meals. I'm like, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah,
but
it's really incredible.
So to bring it back domestically, I want to throw it to one of the questions that came in from our audience, from one of our longtime loyal viewers, Craig, who is also one of our club members. And he said, I believe this is the correct one. If this is actually not Craig's question, the other guy's question, we'll get back to it. But it says, I met Governor Hogan at Beth Shalom congregation in Potomac a few years ago and told him I supported his election twice as governor of Maryland. Here is a Montgomery County Republican resident in Rockville, to which he replied, oh, it got cut off. Oh, got to run to it for my email.
Hold on. I have it here. To which he replied, Democrats let you live here? On this Israeli Memorial Day and the eve of Israel's Independence Day, from your living experiences in Israel, what can we as Jewish Republicans do to better ourselves in Maryland and turn things around for more positive political solutions here and for all of the United States? Toda rabah. Thank you, which means thank you very much in Hebrew. That is an excellent question. And I'm not sure I have, the answer for that. I think the number of Jewish Republicans has been growing slowly but steadily. I think as often a direct result of the Democrats moving further left on many issues and becoming more radically liberal on basically all their issues than they were even 2 years ago or 4 years ago, but also specifically on issues relating to Israel. For a long time, I would say, for the past pre-2008, for the past, for the 20 years before then, Democrats or Republicans, they were pretty much equally as good on Israel. Israel was an 100% bipartisan issue in So both parties were fully committed to Israel. There had always been cranks in both parties who were either anti-Semites or opposed to Israel, or in many cases, as in most times, both of those things. But for the most part, the parties were almost interchangeable on issues relating to Israel. But the Democratic Party has become more and more anti-Israel, I think, in the past couple years, and it's incredibly worrying. There are still many Democrats who are very pro-Israel, but they're a shrinking portion of the Democratic Party. So what can we as Jewish Republicans do? I would say is present a positive, hopeful vision of the Republican Party, of Republican ideals. Don't just make it about all the problems with the Democrats. You can't just be against something all the time. You need to be for something. So that would be my biggest piece of advice on that.
Very popular, Geffen. We never get this many live questions. So Julie L wants to know, would you say President Obama is when we saw the rise of anti-Israel sentiments?
I would hesitate to blame it solely on him. He was not, as good of a friend to Israel as other presidents had been, as other previous Democrat and Republican presidents had been. But I think he is more of he is not the cause. He is an example of the problem. It's
just like the squad is. It's the same thing.
Exactly. It's people see Israel as in the left's term, a colonial white state, totally ignoring that over half of its Jewish population comes from Arab and North African countries, are descended of people who came from those countries. But they see Israel as just an appendage of Europe, totally discounting the actual people who live there.
The diversity of the people who live there.
Exactly. Israel is one of the most diverse countries actually in the world. It has such fantastic food, I think, at least because you have Jews from everywhere in the world immigrated there.
I look at Israel in ways you see like a smaller, almost just a compact version of the US, right? Just a melting pot of different cultures, just no cheeseburgers.
Exactly. It's even like the US, it has many ranges of environments within Israel. Believe it or not, there are areas with snow in Israel up in the north, ranging all the way to the deserts in the south. But yeah, Israel is very much a melting pot because you had so many Jews who were, you had basically half of Europe's Jews, the remaining Jews, after the Holocaust go to Israel. And then after Israel was founded, all the Jews in all the Muslim countries, save for Iran, were expelled and were forced to leave. And today there is pretty much no Jews living in any Arab countries except for now UAE and Bahrain.
One of the long-term issues is the percentage of Jews within Israel demographically has been declining. Now, I'm not sure if there's a point where that all changes. It certainly is something that, how shall I say, that impacts Israeli politics because there are Arabs that get elected, or there are Arabs who get elected to the Knesset and are pretty much outside of direct. I mean, they certainly vote in the Knesset. It's hard to see them participating in a government, so they're not part of the calculation. I'm looking for a way of saying they're not part of the dynamic or calculation that ends up.
I know what you're saying, and that touches on actually 2 points that I'd like to get to. I don't know if you just saw, there was an article, I think I saw it yesterday or the day before, that said that Israel's Jewish population just dropped below 75% for the first time. It's now at 74.9, which, okay, not very different than 75. I think that is mainly due to just higher birth rates among the Arab population of Israel. As women get more educated and are more integrated into the workforce, birth rates fall. That's a practice that's seen everywhere in the world. And I think as that happens, the birth rate of the Arab population will probably fall somewhat. However, one of the things within the Jewish population in Israel is that the ultra-Orthodox have very large families, very, very large families. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9
blows
kids.
my mind watching them walk down the street. It's like a whole horde, like that poor mom.
Secular Israelis actually have actually more kids than other Western countries on average anyways. I believe it is over 3 even children, even in secular families, which is, someone once pointed out that is the very religious Jews in the U.S. have the same number of kids as totally atheist, totally secular Jews in Israel. But the Arab participation in the Knesset, so Arabs have long been about 20%, 25% in between there of Israel's population. However, for a long time, they haven't participated in elections. They've been eligible, and there have been Arab parties. However, they haven't. The Knesset isn't made up, 20, 25% of Arab members. The thing is, no Arab party has ever actually been part of a government in Israel. And it seems like there was actually talk after this past election that one of the Arab parties that broke away from the main Arab party that's called the Joint List, because it's a joint list of smaller parties, a breakaway party from that. There were talks about him joining Netanyahu's government, because he would put Netanyahu and his allies over 61, which would have been unprecedented. Especially unprecedented that it would have been an Arab party putting a right-wing government into power, something no one would have ever expected. But it shows the further integration, I think, of Arabs within Israeli society, in that that's even being talked about as a possibility, as a viable possibility, and for supporting the right-wing government. Because despite what many people hear, Netanyahu, he's championed a bunch of programs for the Arab population in Israel to improve education, jobs, economy, because these are underserved areas within Israel.
So we had one more question come in from the audience I want to make sure we get to. And this is very similar to conversations I've had with my dad over and over. And it almost seems like a question with no answer, which is like, long story short, and then I'll read the question, is why are so many Jewish people in America Democrats? And it makes you think, and I guess it's the only answer I could think of is that, support for Israel is not the only issue in America, as much as it seems like the primary issue for Israeli politics is security. There seem to always be competing issues in the US. So Andy asks, thank you for your question, but he writes, I can't figure this out at all. With all the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic rhetoric and policies that come from this administration, meaning the Biden administration, members of Congress and the Democratic Party over the years, how do they get Democratic support? How do they get Jewish support? What can be done to educate Jewish youth on the connection between Republicans in Congress and the White House and a more prosperous and safer Israel? And I feel like that goes back a little bit to what we were talking about with Craig's question, but I'll see if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, that is a very good question. And there's a famous book by, I believe, the author Norman Podhoretz. It's Why Are Jews Liberals? And I think it comes down to their historical reasons, but I think it mainly comes down to today, at least, just the kind of socioeconomic place Jews are coming from are liberal. You know, the culture they're around is liberal. They grow up around other liberals. They live in liberal areas. So I think that is mainly it. I think, like you were saying, Jackie, Israel isn't the number one voting issue for many Jews. And even if it were, Jews make up a tiny, less than 2% of the American population, a tiny fraction. Though the only place they could really even make a difference is Florida, which is actually a very important state electorally, a very, very important state electorally. But winning over, you know, all the Jews in New York isn't going to help, you know, a Democrat win the White House or a Republican in New York.
Difference. And you know, I think you have something going there with it being a demographic where, you know, where you're growing up and you know, where you're surrounded by, because I mean, I continue to see similarities to Rockville and where we are and the population here and the demographics here, which are obviously deeply, deeply blue, with Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where I grew up, which is also a very high Jewish population, and also New Jersey, certainly not a red state.
Yeah.
I definitely think you're onto something there as well. But
it's definitely a kind of socio-cultural thing that it's, you know, why are people who live in rural areas conservative? It's not simply just because of the policies, it's also the culture. And I think that's just mainly what it is for Jews. It's, you know, Israel is not the most important issue for Jews when voting. Which is something also Jews have felt like they've had to, you know, make that clear oftentimes, especially because historically they were accused of not being loyal to America.
Yeah. But to answer Andy's question in terms of how do you educate Jewish youth, or I would even broaden that to say youth in general, about why they should become engaged with the Republican Party, I would say Jewish specifically, you can look at the Jexit movement has become very, very popular. And for people leaving because specifically of well, maybe other issues, but Israel and Jewish relations as well. Young Republicans, great place to look. Of course, Geffen and myself are both.
It is absolutely.
OIR, so we're always going to tout that. But there are resources out there, and also just having conversations with people. You know, I talk to people my age, younger than me, older than me, who have opposing political viewpoints. And if you can sit down with someone who's willing to agree to disagree, or at least go into it with an open mind and hear what you have to say, that's really the best way to start that conversation, I feel like.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I would also add, especially with young people, don't be a jerk when talking to them. Don't go in saying, oh, you're supporting an anti-Semitic candidate, you're a horrible person. Try to educate them. Nothing turns anyone off more than saying basically they're a bad person. You're not going to win any arguments like that. You need to be positive.
And Mark, I have one more comment on that before I go to yours. I would say the other thing I'd also add is, don't treat young people like their opinion doesn't matter, even if they're either under 18 and can't vote, or if they're college age. Like my family is a very, very close friend who we adore. You know, he's a Hebrew school teacher. He teaches, you know, middle school history, very smart guy. But when I would have political conversations with him, and he's very much a Democrat, when I would have political conversations with him with evidence and with my opinions politically, he'd say, well, you're too young. You don't understand. I'm like, well, no. I mean, some of the smartest people I know, Ryan Nidek, for example, 20 years old, probably knows more about politics and the way that these issues work than most adults. So it's like, don't discount people.
Ryan certainly knows more than me.
Yeah, me as well. So don't discount someone's age for their political opinions and their knowledge. But yeah, Mark.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, one of the domestic issues within the United States that involves Israel's security is the whole boycott, divestiture, sanctions issue, BDS, which has been advanced by some on the left in particular. I think it's been exclusively on the left.
Yes.
But it is an effort to either boycott Israel, to force or require companies to divest from Israel or to not invest in companies that invest in Israel. and to support sanctions. And I guess this is really, how shall I say, potentially, I would argue, an acid test issue for support for Israel, at least here in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
Help me out how that plays out within defining who supports Israel and who doesn't.
That is a great question. I will correct you a little bit, Mark, in that it has been seen on the far right as well in Nazi Germany, when Jewish businesses were boycotted by the Nazi Party.
Well, I was speaking within the United States.
Yes, but now the current BDS, yes,
Correct,
exactly. It is exclusively on the left. So yeah, you have people who say, because what they view as the unfair Israeli actions, oftentimes using based on false information, are very out of context, or just misinterpreted information. They advocate to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. So far, they haven't been very successful in just about anything, except on college campuses, where sometimes the student governments will take a vote on it, but these colleges and universities won't end up actually implementing them because they legally can't.
That's exactly what happened at GW. It was like which is amazing to me, because I think more than half of the student government was Jewish, and I think by one vote they voted for BDS, and this university was like, "Yeah, we're not doing that."
Yeah, it's, the ironic thing is oftentimes a phenomenon for a long time was Israelis. Obviously, Israeli scientists, Israeli academics couldn't, work with anyone from basically any Arab countries. But more recently, you have had academic journals that have refused Israelis, submitting a paper, even if these are Israelis who are, living and working and teaching at a school in the United Kingdom, simply by the fact that they are Israeli. They're not allowed. And the ironic thing is, which is somewhat unsurprising, is that Israeli academics are not people on the far right. These are usually the lefties in Israel. These are the lefties of the lefties. And that's where it's been first seen, really. Look, anyone is free to buy, products from any country they want to, or not buy from any country they want to. That's, a personal decision. But you have these activists trying to force schools into doing this, and they ultimately want to force governments to do this. And the founder of the BDS movement is someone who actually while leading this movement, went to Tel Aviv University, which is a bit hypocritical if you're calling for boycotting all Israeli entities. But he said the goal is to eliminate the state of Israel. So you have these people sometimes saying, "Oh, we're just protesting Israel's actions." No, they're supporting calls for the destruction of Israel, which is absolutely anti-Semitic. Israel is home to close to half the world's Jews. It is the only Jewish state. It is absolutely anti-Semitic to support it at this point. Unless you're, and the thing is also, it would be one thing if these people were saying, anywhere there are any alleged human rights violations, which in the case of Israel are almost always false, we will do this. But these are not people who are arguing, "Oh, let's boycott, let's do BDS for China. Let's do BDS for Russia. Let's do BDS for..." These are the people who are oftentimes most opposed to sanctions on Iran. They're not calling for that for any other country, especially these countries that are absolutely horrible for women, for LGBT people, for minorities. There's zero freedom of expression, freedom of religion. These are the most repressive places on earth. And these people will say, if you ever want to do sanctions or boycotts there, they will say, no, that just hurts people. That doesn't achieve anything. But here for Israel, there are different rules. And when you have different rules for the one Jewish country than you have for everyone else, there's a word for that: anti-Semitism.
Yeah. And obviously this is not something we can delve fully into with 5 minutes left in the show, but it also leads to that question of, there are people out there who are saying, obviously, oh, Israel shouldn't have a right to exist anyway. They stole the land from Palestine. And then you have we need to have a two-state solution. And then that two-state solution basically looks like, let's give most of it to Palestine and the rest of it, that teeny tiny bit, to Israel. Is there like a high-level summary of your take on this two-state solution or anything like that? That, I mean, again, it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I will try to make it compact, which might be a bit difficult. But basically, the original two-state solution, well, okay. So I won't go to the original one, but the main relevant one here was the UN partition plan of 1947. So the mandate, what is called the Mandate of Palestine, comprises what is today Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jordan, which was called Transjordan because it was across the Jordan River. And that was the Mandate of Palestine, which was given to the British after World War I when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And so the British governed it, held on to it. They separated Transjordan from it in two. And they said that they were going to make it a homeland for the Jewish people, make Palestine a homeland for the Jewish people. Palestine had never been a self-governing entity. It had only been it was an administrative unit of, it was either just a kind of geographic region, like we would say Appalachia, or an administrative subdivision for various empires that would rule the area. It originates from the Romans when they expelled the Jews from Judea, and they renamed it Palestine to cleanse it of its Jewish history, to take away the connection between Jews and Judea. But so the UN had the partition plan, and so that split the land. And it was, from the Jewish perspective, it wasn't very good because it was virtually impossible to defend. The Arabs got pretty much all the good land. But the Jews, the Zionists, said, yes, we'll take it because we need it. We need it. We can't say no. The Arabs absolutely, they refused. They refused to accept the plan. So when Israel declared independence, all the Arab countries invaded Israel, and what is today called the West Bank that is just the area that Jordan held on to at the end of the war. The borders of the West Bank are simply the ceasefire lines from the 1948 war. And so Jordan occupied the West Bank and Israel occupied Gaza. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israel conquered those areas and liberated the old city of Jerusalem, which Jews were not allowed to go to under Jordanian rule. The two-state solution, in its most recent, iteration, is the result of negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians that was started in the 1990s. And Israel has gradually given more authority and responsibility to Palestinians to self-govern. However, Palestinians have steadfastly refused to budge on any negotiating issues at all, and now refuse to even come to the negotiating table. They refuse to come to the negotiating table under President Trump. And it seems like they will just continue to refuse. They have been offered a state on multiple times, and they've said no each and every time. Most recently, I believe it was 2008, and also in 2000, the Palestinians said no both times. So I don't know what will happen with that. I don't think there will either just be a continuation of the status quo. I don't think there will be, Israel will annex the West Bank. The vast majority of Israelis don't want it. They don't want to rule over another people. It costs money, it costs lives. Israel doesn't want it, but it is something it has to do currently for its security. But they don't want it forever. So that's my take on a very, very complicated issue.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on as a whole other podcast just on that. But,
yes.
So we are on the last minute of the show. Do you have anything else that you wanted to plug, that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, we are the Montgomery County Young Republicans. We are having a happy hour soon. I do not have the details in front of me. Jackie, to you.
Next Wednesday at 6 o'clock p.m. at Brickside Food and Drink in Bethesda. Dwight can't yell at me for plugging it on here because you did it, not me, and you're the guest.
I guess that's the plug whatever they want. So
yeah,
it's only fair, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
it will be a lot of fun. We'll have great food and drinks, so please join us.
And bring
I don't know that will be the occasion because I'm a little over the sell-by date for the Young Republicans. But in the future, I certainly look forward for your advice and input as to what I should do in Israel later this year.
I would be more than glad to give you a list of all the best places to go, the best food, the best attractions.
Your list of restaurants.
Yeah. You might want to fast for the month preceding it because there's just so much good food there.
And I'm not expecting, you mentioned cheeseburgers, but I'm also not expecting any bacon cheeseburgers.
I would love for you to take a video going up to a McDonald's asking for a bacon cheeseburger.
Yeah, do not expect to be eating any pork while you're in Israel.
Yes, there you go. It's okay.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. We will be back next week with another episode directly competing with the happy hour, but that's fine. I won't hear you at the town hall instead. Thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, Geffen. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.